The learning objectives of this chapter are to understand entry into dangerous, enclosed or confined spaces in the context of the overall safe working practices aboard ship, to know and understand the meaning of the terms associated with entry into enclosed or confined spaces, and to identify the principal hazard associated with entry into dangerous, enclosed or confined spaces. The first step in any potentially hazardous work or task on board is a risk assessment. Based on the findings of the risk assessment, appropriate controls will be put in place to protect those involved in the task under evaluation. Information obtained through these controls will be documented in the work permit. Entry into enclosed or confined spaces for the purposes of inspection, maintenance or cleaning is just such a task. Most companies already have well-established procedures to cover entry into dangerous, enclosed or confined spaces. Prior assessment of the risks is routine, as is the maintenance of safety controls during entry. A standard entry permit will be found in the ship's safety management system. The principal hazard in any enclosed or confined space lies in the atmosphere it contains. A human being needs clean, fresh air with an adequate oxygen content to survive. The air inside an enclosed or confined space may be deficient in oxygen and may include fumes, gases or vapors that are poisonous. Perhaps of greatest significance is the fact that these hazards cannot be seen unless as readings on test equipment, nor can they sometimes be smelled, which is potentially even more dangerous. Therefore, a person who does not understand the risks and cannot readily detect a problem may make a potentially fatal decision in entering the space unprotected. The normal oxygen content in fresh air is around 20.9% by volume. Uncontaminated air with a slightly lower oxygen concentration can be breathed for a short time before the effects become apparent. If the oxygen supply to the brain is reduced, victims will start to feel dizzy and experience headaches before losing consciousness. As such, they may not recognize the danger that is progressively overtaking them until it is too late. Many casualties are found at the foot of entry ladders, having been overcome and fallen as they have attempted at the last minute to exit the space. This is a good time to define a few of the terms that we will use in this module, with some added details where appropriate. Click on the terms for more information. A dangerous space is any enclosed or confined space in which it is anticipated that the atmosphere may at some stage contain toxic or flammable gases or vapors, or other hazardous substances, or be deficient in oxygen, to the extent that it may endanger the life or health of any person entering that space. In a maritime context, the following assumptions are also generally made: that there is limited access to and from the space, a lack of continuous and adequate ventilation exists or has existed, and that the space is not regularly and routinely entered or intended for human occupancy. An enclosed space is any space, other than a confined space, which is enclosed by bulkheads and an overhead closure. Examples include cargo tanks and holds. A confined space is any space or void which, by its design and restricted nature, creates or aggravates a hazardous exposure to any person entering it. This, then, is more dangerous than an enclosed space, in that additional hazards are introduced by the inability of a person to enter and move about freely within the space. Examples include double bottom and storage tanks. In terms of the basic precautions, enclosed and confined spaces are very similar, but additional precautions may be necessary for confined spaces. Many standard regulations and safety management systems refer simply to enclosed space entry, and actually, for the seafarer, the name or exact definition is of little relevance. Proper risk analysis and the procedures that are implemented as a result are based on evaluation of a situation, rather than being able to assign it to a particular hazard category. There is, however, a difference between a dangerous enclosed or confined space in which the atmosphere is or is suspected to be hazardous, and an enclosed or confined space in which the atmosphere has been rendered safe. Certain spaces immediately fit the definition of a dangerous space, such as cargo tanks and holds, ballast and service tanks. Other spaces may temporarily be considered within the terms outlined. Pump rooms, storerooms, even areas within machinery or other equipment accessed for maintenance may have limited access, be rarely entered, and have not been ventilated for an extended period. Indeed, it may not be immediately obvious that entry into a particular space requires the implementation of enclosed space entry procedures. The list includes, but is not limited to, cargo tanks, deep tanks or cargo holds, cargo containers, ballast tanks and double bottoms, cofferdams or other similar void spaces, chain lockers, duct keels and other trunkways, fuel tanks, service compartments such as water, waste and chemical storage tanks, pump rooms, rarely used storerooms and deck houses, areas within machinery spaces capable of being entered such as crankcases, scavenging air spaces, exhaust ducting, boiler drums, furnaces, stack casings and condensers, service equipment compartments, particularly those housing nitrogen or inert gas generating plant that remain closed for extended periods. Let's continue with a few more definitions and explanations. Click on the terms for more information. A tank, compartment or container that is in a suitable and safe condition, such that sufficient fresh air has been introduced into it to lower the level of any flammable, toxic or inert gas to that required for a specified purpose, is said to be gas-free. Tests to verify this condition must be carried out by an authorized person, using an approved testing instrument. A certificate or permit must be issued to indicate that a space is gas-free before the intended task can take place. Readings entered on a certificate are those determined at the time of testing. An entry permit is a controlled document issued by a responsible person permitting entry to a designated space or compartment for and during an indicated time interval for the purposes of carrying out a specified task. A responsible officer or responsible person is a person appointed by the employer or to whom the master of the ship has delegated responsibility as permitted by the safety management system and empowered to take charge of a specific task. Risk assessment is a methodical examination of the circumstances surrounding a proposed work task, with the intention of identifying any hazards present, determining who or what might be harmed, assessing the likelihood of such harm or damage occurring if the work activity takes place, and the possible consequences, together with an evaluation of the existing controls and the application of any further precautions that might be required in order to eliminate or minimize those risks. Asphyxia is the condition arising when the blood is deprived of an adequate supply of oxygen, so that loss of consciousness may follow. Toxic means poisonous to human life. Approved equipment is equipment of a design tested and approved by an appropriate authority, such as a government department or classification society, and certified by that authority for use in a specified hazardous environment. If applicable, such equipment must have been examined, serviced, calibrated and certified within a designated period. An oxygen analyzer or meter is an instrument for measuring the percentage of oxygen in a sample of the atmosphere drawn from a tank or compartment. Readings are expressed in terms of percentage by volume. An explosimeter or combustible gas indicator is an instrument for detecting a combustible gas-air mixture, usually measuring its concentration in terms of the lower flammable limit, or LFL. A resuscitator unit contains equipment to assist or restore the breathing of a casualty overcome by gas or by lack of oxygen. A self-contained breathing apparatus is an independent, portable supply of compressed air contained in a pressurized cylinder or cylinders and mounted on a frame and harness provided to the user through an airtight face mask. The supply remaining is indicated on a pressure gauge, and an audible alarm sounds when the safe minimum is reached. Only sets of the positive pressure type should be used in enclosed space entry. Self-contained equipment is widely considered safer, as it does not rely on equipment or an operator at a remote location. It is the more common form of breathing apparatus equipment found at sea today. An airline breathing apparatus comprises a face mask supplied by air through a small diameter hose leading outside the space in which it is being used and connected to either compressed air cylinders, usually mounted on a trolley, or a compressor. Airflow is regulated by a flow control valve or orifice, and the hose is attached to a belt or other arrangement in such a way that it permits quick and easy disconnection in the event of an emergency. If a compressor is used, the arrangement will include an emergency supply of air in cylinders for use in the event of the compressor failing. The operator outside the space will make the switch, and it will not be necessary for the user to remove any part of the equipment or any protective clothing to change over to the emergency supply. If a remote bottle bank is used, the operator can exchange exhausted bottles with charged ones while the operation is in progress, thereby prolonging the working time of the supply. An alternative safety arrangement involves the use of a small, conventional, self-contained breathing apparatus set of a capacity that will safely allow escape from an enclosed or confined space, which has a connection for an external airline and a valve that switches locally between the two supplies. Airline equipment enables compressed air to be supplied for longer periods than would be possible with a self-contained set. Without the need to carry large air bottles, the equipment is also much lighter and simpler to operate. It may also be designed and arranged to supply several users simultaneously through a single system. A completely separate supply of clean air should be available inside the space for evacuation in the event of complete failure of the airline system. It is recommended that the user should carry an Emergency Escape Breathing Device, or EEBD, when he enters the space. It must, however, be clearly understood that this device is for the sole purpose of emergency escape and should not be used as an alternative to a working supply when in compartments containing oxygen-deficient atmospheres. A particular form of enclosed space entry, sometimes referred to as tank entry, is a routine part of the cleaning and preparation phase of cargo work on a tanker. From the nature of the particular trade, it is carried out a lot more frequently on a parcel chemical tanker than, for example, on a large crude oil tanker or gas carrier. Certain other types of vessel, such as fishing boats or dredgers, will carry significant enclosed space entry risks related to their trade. By way of further contrast, the occasions on which an enclosed or confined space needs to be entered on a passenger liner or a tugboat are comparatively rare, other than for maintenance and inspection. The various vessel types are also treated differently by the regulations contained in the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, otherwise referred to as SOLAS 1974, in terms of the working and safety equipment they are required to carry. Once again, a tanker is normally equipped with different and usually more testing and safety equipment than a cargo ship. Although pump rooms come within the definition of an enclosed space, they have their own particular equipment, characteristics and risks which require special precautions and procedures. Cargo pump rooms are of course significantly more dangerous than ballast pump rooms, which contain no pumps or piping that are cargo-related. Pump rooms may not be routinely entered for long periods on passage, but can be frequently entered during cargo operations. The risk of hazardous vapours entering a cargo pump room is, however, an ever-present one. SOLAS requires mechanical ventilation to be fitted to pump room spaces in order to maintain a safe atmosphere within. Ships built after July 1, 2002 also have to have continuous atmosphere monitoring equipment and alarms. The ventilation fans must be running throughout cargo operations or other periods when access is required. Of particular relevance to this training module is the type of breathing apparatus used by the different types of vessel. While SOLAS governs the provision of protective equipment for firefighting purposes, the International Safety Management, or ISM code, requires the ship operator to provide an adequate level of working equipment. Respiratory protective devices provided for this purpose will normally exceed the minimum requirements of SOLAS. Portable self-contained breathing apparatus is commonly preferred today on tankers, but the airline type is still found on other types of vessel. Generally, however, the self-contained breathing apparatus is progressively replacing the airline type. If a space is not considered at risk, a work permit may not have been issued, but due caution must always be exercised. A work permit that has been issued for an enclosed or confined space reflects the conditions at the time of testing, but circumstances can change even over a relatively short time, and personnel must be aware of this possibility. Due caution must again always be exercised. Click on the circumstances to gain more information. A space that is usually continuously or adequately ventilated, but which suffers a loss or reduction of ventilation, should then be considered as dangerous and treated as an enclosed space for the purpose of entry procedures. If it is suspected that there could be a deficiency in oxygen in a space, or that toxic gases, vapours or fumes might be present, despite readings indicated on a permit, then the space should be considered dangerous and new testing procedures initiated. In particular, if the reason for entry is to investigate a possible crack or valve leakage, and there is product in the adjacent space, then the presence of both liquid and vapours must be anticipated. If this happens during entry, then the space should immediately be exited, and the appropriate tags placed on the access to prohibit further entry. The responsible person should be notified, the permit cancelled, and further tests should then be made. It is essential to continue to monitor an enclosed or confined space that has been tested and certified safe for entry and which has been entered, in order to confirm that the necessary conditions continue to be met. Your own company safety management system will contain details of the exact procedures that apply on board your ship. Reference should be made to the applicable areas for further information. There are also a number of industry-standard manuals commonly available in the ship's official publications library, which have specific guidelines on enclosed or confined space entry. These include the Code of Safe Working Practices for Merchant Seamen, published by HMSO for the UK Maritime and Coast Guard Agency, and, for those working on tankers, the International Safety Guide for Tankers and Terminals, ISCOT, manual, and the applicable International Chamber of Shipping Tanker Safety Guide. In mid-September 2000, a Russian cargo ship, on passage from Riga, Latvia to Poole, UK, with a cargo of sawn timber and bundles of pallet timber, was about 70 miles north-northwest of the Hook of Holland, in the southern North Sea. A seaman who was working in the forecastle went aft, saying he was going to the bathroom. About 15 or 20 minutes later, the boatswain, who was also working forward, also went aft. As he passed down the port side of number 2 hold, he noticed the deck cargo tarpaulin lashings were undone, and the tarpaulin had been lifted back. He looked closer and found the hatch cover to number 2 hold access shaft wedged open. At the bottom of the shaft, he saw the first seaman's body. The boatswain immediately raised the alarm and called for assistance. When help arrived, the boatswain donned a self-contained breathing apparatus and entered the shaft, with other crew members supporting his efforts from outside the shaft. The seaman was removed to deck, but, despite prolonged attempts at resuscitation, he could not be revived. When the ship arrived in Poole, the police and the British Marine Accident Investigation Branch investigated the incident. Before cargo operations were commenced, atmospheric tests were taken on the access shaft where the seaman had been found. Very low levels of oxygen, together with high levels of carbon monoxide, were recorded. With police, fire brigade and customs officials in attendance, the deck cargo was removed and the holes were opened. Apart from a distinctive smell, there was no evidence of fire or any chemical reaction, either in the access shaft or in the cargo itself. There were no technical or operational reasons for the seaman to have entered the shaft. He had not been instructed to do so by the boatswain or by any officer on board. It was concluded that he had made a personal decision to enter, and for an unknown reason. The cause of death was most probably due to the low oxygen and high carbon monoxide levels present in the access shaft to number 2 hold at the time the victim entered the space. Timber cargoes are a recognized source of oxygen depletion and carbon monoxide generation in enclosed spaces.